The Whistle Man. The story's been passed down through my family for generations. My grandfather's father, which would make him my great-grandfather, used to talk about the Whistle Man. These days, these things are called Sasquatch or Bigfoot, whichever you prefer. They're all one and the same as far as I know. My dad asked his grandfather why it was called the Whistle Man. He told him that one day he might hear the whistles himself. My great-granddad was born in the late 1800s and did most of his growing up in the early 1900s. I can only imagine the things he must have seen in those North Georgia mountains, but there are a few that he would talk about. Before I get going too far, let me just warn you, as everyone does with these kind of stories. This is some hard crap to believe. Hell, I don't even know how much of it I believe. But I can tell you this with absolutely no doubt. My grandfather is one of the best men I've ever known, and he's only surpassed by my dad. There are no two men I respect more on this planet than those two. I obviously didn't know my great-granddad, but that's exactly what both of these men say about him. That's the only proof I need. If you need more, there's nothing else I can do for you. The story begins in the fall of some year in the early 20th century, between 1905 and 1910, as I was told. As I mentioned, my family lived in the North Georgia mountains. We still live there to this day. My great-granddad would spend all of his free time in the woods, after his chores of working on the farm were done, of course. I know the family milked the cows and the chickens would lay their eggs. This wasn't a huge farm with a lot of money coming in. To hear my grandpa tell it, they were quite poor, but they were happy. Like I was saying, he would spend all of his free time in the woods. In the woods with the Whistle Man. I'll jump right to it, because I don't know a better way to say it. My great-grandfather's best friend was a Sasquatch. There you have it. Laugh if you will, but it's the truth. I'm going to tell you what I was told about how they met. He was walking through the woods one day when the whistling began. This was nothing new to him. He heard it every time he went out. He said one day he asked his uncle who or what was whistling over on the North Ridge. His uncle told him that it was a booger. He said that he had seen it several times and that some of the old folks called him the Whistle Man. So I guess that's where the name originated. His uncle told him to be very careful. He said that the thing had never bothered him before, but he knew that there were more. But that one, as far as he knew, was harmless. As you can imagine, his mind started working overtime, and after that, it was pretty much all that he could think about. He started going over to the North Ridge almost every day after his work was done. He wanted so badly to see the Whistle Man, but all he ever got was the whistles. He started racking his brain, trying to come up with a way to get the thing to come out and make itself known. All he wanted was a peek. One day after milking the cows, he slid a small jar of fresh milk off to the side and then hid it behind a woodpile. He had already put a couple of biscuits from breakfast in his pocket. When all the work was done, he grabbed that jar of milk and those biscuits and tore off up the ridge behind the house. In no time, he was over on the North Ridge. He stood beside this old oak tree, one of the biggest around, and he started to yell out. I don't know if you can hear me, or if you even understand me, but I brought you something. I'd like to meet you and learn from you. I'm going to leave these right here on this stump. He felt plumb stupid yelling that out at absolutely no one, but he didn't know what else to do. The next day, he did the same thing. Got some fresh milk and a couple of biscuits, and this time he brought a small jar of honey. When he got to the stump, he couldn't believe what he saw. The biscuits were gone, but he expected that. Anything could have gotten those. But the jar of milk, though, that shocked him to his core. The empty jar was half in a hole that was about 5 feet off the ground up in this old oak tree. When he pulled the jar out, it had a couple of stones and some dried-out flowers crammed into it. He couldn't believe what he was holding, but as he was looking at it in his hand, the loudest whistle he had ever heard rang out and caused him to drop the glass jar. He jumped and spun around to see nothing at all. He thought to himself, dang, that was close. He set the biscuits, milk, and honey on the stump and began to yell out, Thank you for my gift. I'm glad that you enjoyed yours. I would really like to thank you in person one day. Again, he felt stupid for doing this, but what did he have to lose? This routine went on for weeks, and each time the return whistles got closer and closer. Finally, whether he was ready or not, his request was about to be granted. It was a day just like the last 15 or so. He brought the goods and sat them on the stump and received his gift. But this time, there was no whistle. This caught him off guard, and he admitted that he at first thought that the whistle man just wasn't around. But little did he know he was about to find out how mistaken he was. Instead of a whistle, he heard what he called a grunt. He said that it was weird, though, because he felt it more than he heard it. He was terrified in that moment. The same sound came from directly behind him. He stood there and gathered the nerve to turn around. He immediately regretted the decision to come out there. But what could he do now? He reminded himself that this is exactly what he had been working towards and waiting for all this time. He then turned around and got the shock of his life. He said that what he saw was a giant. So frightened at what he was seeing, he lost control of his bladder and he pissed himself. He stood there trembling and now wet from the waist down. He watched this thing standing there swaying ever so gently from left to right. The first thought that he had was, how in the hell did this thing get so close to me without making a sound? It was right there, less than 20 feet from him, just standing there out in the open. He could see every inch of this thing. He talked about how human this thing looked. He had hair all over him, except for his face. He said that he was positive if it wanted to, it could have fit 2 oranges in its mouth. The nose was flat and wide. He was brown in color and had a single white or gray patch above his left ear. He could only see the ears a couple of times because they were covered with hair, but he said that they were much smaller than his own. He didn't know if that was something that was common for all of them or just something that was unique to this one, but they were extremely small. You've heard me call it an it or he a few times, and there's a reason for that. His penis was visible, so it was definitely a male. He was 8 feet 7 inches tall. How he knows this, we'll talk about later. And as for his feet, he always said that it was fitting that they were called Bigfoot. His feet were just under 19 inches long and 8 inches wide, just below the toes at the widest point. Okay, at this point, you're probably asking, how did he know these measurements? As their friendship progressed, my grandpa was able to measure him. He took one of his mother's measuring strips that she used for sewing. My dad said that he laughed one time when he talked about measuring his feet. He said that the big guy kept getting tickled and he was pulling away. He talked about it not sounding like a normal laugh that you and I would make, but that's what he got the feeling that he was doing. His meetings with the whistle man went on almost daily for 2 years, and then one day, they just stopped. He has no idea why. There was no indication that he was sick or that there was anything wrong. He just stopped showing up, and the gifts that my grandpa would leave stopped getting taken. Well, at least taken by the big guy anyway. He could tell that something was getting in them because there would be crumbs everywhere and half-eaten biscuits left, and the jars of milk would be knocked over. Before, there would always be something left in it in return, and it was always placed in the hole in the tree. My great-grandpa was heartbroken, to say the least. He continued going out there almost daily for another 6 or 8 months, hoping for the return of the whistle man. But he never came back, and he never knew what happened to him. It's not like he could file a missing persons report or anything. Although he never saw him again, he did say that many times throughout his life, he would hear a distant whistle. Do with this what you will, but as I said, the men in my family were all amazing and honorable men. I'm the man I am today because of them. I know my great-grandpa loved that big dude. And if I'm being honest, I wish I could say someday that I had that kind of relationship with one of them.